This is Reah, and this is Just the Who of Us, where we talk about a range of topics including life events, current events, spirituality, entertainment, family relationships, as well as answering listener questions and more.
All right, welcome back. Today we have Taylor Locke with us again. Today we're going to be discussing domestic violence within the LGBTQ plus community in relation to mental health and substance abuse. Today we have Taylor Locke here again to help us to join in this discussion, and let's get to it. So, as some of you might know, some of you may not know, October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month as well as LGBTQ plus History Month. And so this is the perfect topic to tie those two together and create a little bit of awareness and bring a little education to the outside community on this issue that really needs a more attention than it gets. Um, Welcome back.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
So first, let's talk about mental health and domestic violence in relation to, or mental health and substance abuse in relation to domestic violence. Um, I think that this is definitely, like I said, something that doesn't get enough attention, and it really should, because there is definitely a heteronormative agenda when it comes to domestic violence and really mental health in general. First, I wanted to, for those of you who don't know what heteronormative means, um, heteronormative just means that the worldview, the general worldview is promotes more of a heterosexual agenda as the normal. So heteronormative, it's things like domestic violence get this kind of only focus from the heterosexual community. Um, when you think domestic violence, you typically think a woman getting abused by a man, right? And a lot of times that is kind of it's one thing that, of course, the media shines light on certain things in a heteronormative agenda, right? Because that's the quote unquote societal norm is to be straight and uh, when it comes to things like domestic violence within this community, it's often stigmatized as either normal. I've actually heard someone say that, well, lesbian relationships have a high domestic violence, and I think that I heard that and I was like, it kind of like rubbed me the wrong way because, well, for one, anytime you stigmatize something like that, that's, you put that onto the world, and that's the view that people are naturally going to have, especially people who don't support lesbian relationships. Now it's kind of like giving them more fuel to the fire to be against it, right? Um, and it's not that there's a agenda or a goal to make heterosexual relationships like be frowned upon, but it is kind of like statistically speaking, when you look at heterosexual relationships, the reported domestic violence is usually done by women assaulted by men in those relationships, right? But as we know, those are not the only types of relationships, and therefore they're not the only types of relationships that should have numbers, have reports. Tell me a little bit about your view on this topic and how this relates to you in your personal life, making it an important topic for you.
Thank you. Yeah, no, that's really a lot to unpack there. I think to start off with is within, the domestic violence field, like you said, there's a lot of um, heteronormative lens that's used where it's always the uh, I guess, traditional view of domestic violence, where it's a heterosexual relationship and the man is the abuser and the woman is the victim. And kind of always looking at domestic violence through that lens can be harmful whenever you're looking at situations that are not the case.
Yes.
Um, you are essentially stereotyping domestic violence as it's always this thing, and it makes it that much more difficult for people who are in non-traditional, like queer relationships to be able to recognize domestic violence because they don't see it as something that's related to them. And similarly, it also makes it that much more difficult, even within heterosexual relationships, where it's the opposite, what's considered the norm of the gender roles, where the male is the victim and the female is the abuser, for them to be able to recognize it, and to come forward and report that. And a lot of times, again, within the domestic violence community, they always kind of go back to the statistics. It's like, well, the majority of the cases are this way, so we're going to base our system off of that. It's like, okay, but if you're basing your system off of that, it makes it harder for these people to come forward, and therefore the statistics keep lining up with the system that you've then built. Um, and kind of like what you were saying, with like the statistic with lesbian couples having high rates of domestic violence, just because that statistic is there doesn't mean that we should change our systems to then be modeled off of that. We should make our systems be accessible for all types of relationships. Um, Another thing that's really common with that is there's a lot of different terms, like there's domestic violence, intimate partner violence, gender-based violence, and they're kind of all used interchangeably, but they don't necessarily always mean the same thing. Um, it's important to look at gender-based violence, because that is a thing. But when you conflate that with domestic violence, where you kind of paint both of those with the same brushstrokes, that makes it harder to be able to help people that don't fall under that norm. And the same thing with intimate partner violence, where it's like that's not exactly the same thing as domestic violence either. You're talking about, people who are in some type of intimate relationship versus people who live together. When I've worked professionally in the DV field, encountered situations where it was like someone was in a domestic violence situation with their roommate, and it was difficult because of, the lease for the apartment and having to navigate all of that. That's still domestic violence because those are two people that live together domestically, but not intimate partner violence. So
Yes.
when we're talking about these things, particularly about using statistics and, talking about systems, it's really important to make sure that we're being mindful exactly what it is that we're talking about, of those different types of categories that something can fall into, and particularly if it's not specifically gender-based violence that we're talking about specifically, that we need to make sure that we are designing our systems to be mindful of those other types of relationships, and that our conversations are, the language that we're using is more inclusive, because otherwise we're going to keep going along this same heteronormative path that been going on, and making it harder for people to be able to come forward and to support those individuals.
100%. I think you made a few really good points there. One is that it wording, right? Wording is important. And when we naturally think of domestic violence, we think of romantic relationships. Domestic violence is actually defined as violent or aggressive behavior within the home. So typically, violent when you look on Google specifically, Google says typically involving the violent abuse of a spouse or partner. However, like you stated, there are other types of domestic relationships. This could be, like you said, just in the household. Um, a few when I and obviously anybody who knows me or listens know that I don't just take all my information off Google. I'm really big on scholarly sources and really doing my research. But I wanted to specifically refer to Google because that is the most common used search engine, right? And a lot of people don't understand the value of like educated resources. So if you look at Google specifically, when I looked up the heteronormative narrative. What I got, the first thing that came up was zero tolerance to women slash girls in relation to domestic violence. And it's really supports like, the kind of main focus of today. One of the main focuses of that, if you look into information on domestic violence, it specifically goes to protect the woman hurt by the man. And like I said, when you think of typically domestic violence, we just naturally go to, oh, the woman was abused by the husband. And that's not all that encompasses domestic violence. And so it's really important that people understand that as well. Um, Two reasons is that if you it limits members of the community to recognizing behaviors. So if you are in a quote unquote non-traditional relationship and you all you're used to seeing is help for traditional relationships, you might not even recognize that the behaviors that are being inflicted on you are unhealthy behaviors. A lot of this, a lot of how our views on society are stemmed from what we see in our own home and what we see out in the world. And if the majority of both is heteronormative, then not quote unquote being in that traditional relationship really limits your scope to be able to realizing when you are a victim and when you should reach out for support and when you deserve to receive that support, right? Because any mistreatment deserves to receive support. And whether that be a community program, family, friends, if you don't know that you're being mistreated, a lot of times we don't know that it's time to obtain that help. Um, Also, underreporting. Support being ignored is also kind of a uh, not result, but like I can't think of the word. uh, I guess a result of underreporting, right? Again, if you don't know that you're being mistreated, you don't know to report things, you don't know to reach out for help, and this is why the heteronormative of perception of domestic violence is really something that needs to be advocated against. We want people to recognize, we want people to get help, and we want people to understand that there is help out there for you as well. Um, Another,
Absolutely.
yeah, another reason that I have found that people sometimes hesitate to obtain help or education or connections. Most of the time, when we think of the LGBTQ plus community, we think of people who are out, people who, well, they express that they identify as this specific thing, and that's not always the case. As you have briefly mentioned on previous episodes, you weren't supported by your family. And for most people, I don't want to speak for other people, right? But in my opinion, in my observation, most people hesitate to express their sexuality for fear of ridicule. I even had in my own experience, I had a conversation with my a member of my family, and they were very like disgusted in their reaction. They asked me a question, "Are you bisexual?" And I was like, "Yeah," because they saw like a post something on Facebook. This was when I really first got into advocacy, and they were like, "Are you?" And I was like, "Yeah." And they were like, "Oh my God." And I'm like, "Oh, but nothing about me has changed. So I'm still the same person you always knew. So you didn't find me disgusting before that, like before that information." So it's always interesting to me how people react. Like nothing about me has changed. I've been this way before you knew, and you liked me then. And so I can only imagine coming out as gay to or as queer to a conservative family or an unsupportive family. And that's the case for a lot of people. A lot of people, and in this instance, in relation to domestic violence, a lot of people don't report things for fear of ridicule. And that's, it's sad because everybody deserves support.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And kind of heading on to that with, like you said, with the stigma around it. Because there's fear of coming out as a queer individual to people who might not be supportive of your identity. And there's also a lot of fear about, you know, speaking out about, even if you might recognize that you're in a domestic violence situation, seeking out support for that.
Yes.
Just
Yeah.
again, that fear component is huge. And I think another thing that kind of needs to be changed in terms of like the framework of the system itself is kind of addressing some of the barriers to seeking out support, and some of the stigmas even within the uh domestic violence like support community itself, like you had mentioned earlier, with like the intersectionality between like mental health and substance use disorder. Like there's been so many studies to show that there's huge correlation between all three of those.
Hmm.
um it's usually either like the domestic violence will happen and then that will lead to causation of one or both of the other two, or the other way around, but there's just such huge intersectionality there. But then there's a lot of times where you're trying to you actually are able to be like, okay, I need help, I need support, but domestic violence shelters will have rules where they can't take someone who's um you know using or has substance use issues, and then you go to a substance use treatment place and they can't take someone with domestic violence issues. Or then you might also have someone who's like facing homelessness, and they'll also have rules where they can't take someone who's in either of those two situations.
Yeah.
And then in all three of those, less so with the substance use, but more so in a lot of times with like the homeless shelters and domestic violence things, they're really lacking in terms of mental health support, where it's kind of only just like touching on bare minimum things in terms of mental health treatment and support, if any, and really like focused on the larger situation, which is like housing or domestic violence, which is like that's important. But if you're not providing the additional support, there's no guarantee that that person's not going to still have problems with those issues. You need to be able to not only make sure that like they are in a safe and stable environment, but that they can stay that way.
Yeah.
And if you're not providing that support, then you're not helping them to the fullest extent that you can. And
Right.
particularly with domestic violence too, um, there's a lot of like black and white thinking there with like labels in terms of like abuser and victim. And the cycle of abuse is real. And if you're not working to help support the person to process through the trauma and making sure that they are able to go through that and deal and cope with that in a healthy way, there's no guarantee that they might not turn into becoming a abusive partner for someone else in the future.
Yeah.
So you need to be like really careful with the black and white thinking and the labels, and you also need to change a lot of parts of the systems to make sure that there's no reason that mental health treatment, substance use treatment, and domestic violence shelters shouldn't be working together to be able to supporting all of the needs of an individual instead of just focusing on one, or potentially not being able to support them with any because they have these co-occurring issues as well.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And I'm glad you brought up the information on like the limited scope, the shelters. And those are actually a couple points that I plan to make as well. One of the issues within community support is shelters. Shelters in particular are typically geared to straight women of domestic violence by men. And so with that focus, it doesn't include anyone else. And like you said, it can be very hard to get assistance through community programs or shelters when it's still really stigmatized. Well, we cater to this group of people because that's the group of people that need help, but then we neglect everyone else. And I don't know whether that's done intentionally or it's just because things haven't changed in a very long time. This systemic process that we are so very slowly working on progress toward. One of the issues, another one of the issues, is limiting the scope, which is limiting relatability and support. So when you don't feel like you can, like when you don't feel like these things are available to you, you feel very unrelated to. Um, and it continues the heteronormative agenda that, okay, well, this is the community this happens in, this is the community we're focused on. But people also are not going to reach out for support if they don't feel relatable, like, okay, well, I don't feel like there is support for me. So what can I do in a sense? And then you feel just kind of stuck in this situation. And then we do create things like generational trauma and these patterns that don't become broken because we just don't feel like there's support to help us do so. Um, I want to talk about your community advocacy and how you relate your experience to advocacy within your community.
Yeah. So I don't think we've talked about this specifically on any of these podcast episodes, but I am a survivor of sexual assault. Um, and that was something I experienced during my freshman year of college. And it was actually really the aftermath of that that kind of sent me on my advocacy journey. Uh, both with it was about a year after that happened that I was disowned by my biological family, sort of as a direct result to that and a bunch of other issues that were happening. Um, and a large part of that was because someone who, was born male and being sexually assaulted by a female, that was something that they couldn't accept or understand at all. Um, and then there was my school's response to that, um, where I reported it, and then I was pressured into going on a medical leave of absence for my mental health, which wasn't something that I really wanted to do.
Yeah.
And then I didn't feel like I had any support. And a few months after that, I did have a suicide attempt. And then I was placed on a forced medical leave of absence, even though my doctors from the hospital said it would be much better for me to continue in school with the support
Yeah.
of my friends. Um, and other support systems I had in place there than it would be to send me back home with an abusive environment there. But my school didn't care and sent me home anyway. And also because I was no longer considered a student during that time, I couldn't continue to pursue a Title IX investigation against the other student who had assaulted me.
Oh
So I
my.
had to wait. I had to reapply to school because I was no longer considered a student, get accepted to come back. Um, and then after I did that, restart the Title IX investigation. And now it's been like over a year since the assault, when they're actually starting the investigation. And then that took like over 10 months to do the whole investigation process. And they were continuously pressuring against me the entire time to, just drop it, go with an informal resolution, everything, even though that's not what I wanted. Um, Shockingly, they did actually find the other person having violated school's Title IX policy, and
Nice.
actually having, sexually assaulted me. Uh, but that finding did nothing because the following semester after that, they were permitted to be an RA in freshman dorms. And then the semester after that, they graduated with honors. with nothing on their record and absolutely no repercussions. So I went through everything I went through with, dealing with my family, dealing with the school, getting kicked out of school, and had all of that as, the victim. But the perpetrator, who they actually found guilty of being the perpetrator, uh, was essentially rewarded. So that was really what made me just look at the system and be like, no, this is messed up, this is broken,
Yeah.
and want to do something to fix it. And that's obviously broadened a lot more, just not just for sexual assault, but also domestic violence in general, LGBTQ rights, mental health, all of that, because I think those issues are all so interrelated,
Yes.
in terms of being able to support people, and those are also all issues that I've had to deal with on a personal level. But yeah, it's definitely my personal journey and experience, particularly surrounding my assault and what happened as a result of that, that's really pushed me into becoming an advocate. And it's that story that continues to motivate me, and I continue to share that in like appropriate advocacy forums and talking with legislators for pushing for policies that are supporting people and helping people, because the systems that we have in place right now are not doing that.
But it's one of the things that I admire about you. And if you've listened to any of Taylor's other episodes, I can't imagine that you don't feel the same way. Like, one thing that I admire so much is that you took this situation and you said, I'm going to speak out about this. I may not have gotten exactly what I feel like I should have gotten out of it. But with that, I'm going to take it and I'm going to do more. And I'm going to advocate for other people because a lot of times, too, we go through life experiences and we become defeated feeling because we don't get the response or the repercussions against the guilty party that we feel like we should have. And a lot of times it kind of kicks us down. I know someone in particular who they reported an assault and this like nothing happened, and it still to this day bothers them and they still suffer from depression and they go to therapy and they're like, well, I talk to people and I don't feel like anything is helping. And this is very common. And so we kind of get stuck, and not everybody chooses to speak out. And I think that it's wonderful that you took this situation and you said, you know what? I'm going to keep going with this, not only because this affected me, but it affects other people. What can I do to help the other people who are also affected by this same situation? I think that's absolutely fabulous, and I admire it so much, especially in someone so young.
Thank you. Yeah, no, like I said, it this wasn't about justice for me because I already tried that and it didn't work. This is about fixing the system for other people because I feel like the system failed me and I don't want someone else to have to go through what I went through.
Yeah, yeah, I love it so much. Um, I think that think I hit my point. Is there anything else that I know if you've listened to the other episodes, we kind of intentionally didn't mention the personal experience point until this conversation because this conversation deserved that focus a little bit more in relation to the point that I really want to drive home is don't be afraid to be an advocate for your community and don't be afraid to speak out for other people. A lot of times we do find ourselves in situations where we don't feel like local authorities do what they should. And it shouldn't stop with us. Don't be scared to take it a little higher and keep taking it higher so that other people don't have to go through what you went through. And it may not punish the person who was inappropriate to you, but it becomes so much bigger than just us. You know, we can take our life experiences and we can let them kind of beat us down, or we can take them and say, you know what, I want to make a change. And whether that change be I'm going to go to therapy and I'm going to, you know, put these things, I want to learn effective communication. I'm going to maybe take a self-defense class, you know, whatever, something that might seem quote unquote minor to you. If it helps you protect yourself and educate yourself, you also put that out into the world. So I'm not saying that everyone has to go, you know, be a physical and verbal advocate out in the community, but also when we put work and healing and love into ourselves, we also affect our community in that way as well. So I also will be sure to put some information on domestic violence support in the description of this video or episode, however you're listening to it. Is there anything else that you want to cover before we wrap up?
I think one thing that I want to touch on, kind of like in conclusion, both to this conversation and the other ones we've had previously leading up to this, is, for like you said, for me, my, trauma and experiences are what motivated me into wanting to become an advocate to change this for other people. But whatever it is that helps you to recover from whatever issues that you might face, it's really important to, to focus on those and to focus on you. Because, again, we don't live in a perfect world. Bad things happen to good people more often than they should,
Yeah.
and it's really important to, be focusing on your own well-being and to be able to, continue existing and being there and being present in whatever space that you might be, whether it's, if you want to get into advocacy, or if you want to do whatever it is you want to do with your life. And I also want to say that, whatever path that might take you on, you're always going to have people that are going to be like obstacles or not where you're supposed to be.
Yeah.
And it's important for you to also like recognize that and to move around that and not let those people, or obstacles to drag you down. I know for me, because I had for a short period of time like worked directly in the domestic violence field as, um like working at a shelter, and doing like educational outreach and stuff. And it because of certain issues with the current system in place, it was really invalidating for me in my experiences, because every time I tried to bring up the fact that we need to be more inclusive about non-heteronormative stereotypes, I was always shot down and it was referred to the statistics. It's like, okay, but I'm not one of those statistics, and what you're saying is
Yeah.
invalidating to me in my experiences. So I was like, this is not the right path for me. So I moved around that. And now I'm still involved in like advocacy, but more on like the higher end of we need to change these systems as a whole to be more inclusive to these people and to be more supportive with helping them with all of their needs, not just domestic violence, but mental health and substance abuse and all of that. And so that was, even though it wasn't great at the time, it was an experience that has been a part of my advocacy journey that's helped me as well. And so for anyone else that, might be surrounded by people that are kind of, or people or environments that are dragging you down, it's important to recognize that and to move forward and move past that and to always do what's best for you, because that's what's most important.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I wanted to mention something really quickly. I'm probably going to actually put this in an earlier part of the conversation, but I wanted to briefly touch on homelessness. So I've had, we have a large homeless population in a specific part of our city, kind of like you come off the highway and there's all the, you know, restaurants and fast foods and all these things. There's you see a large amount of homeless kind of going into kind of before you get to downtown. And when I first moved here, I was just like, man, coming from living in a really big city, you see homeless community, but they're kind of more spread out because it's a larger city. And here it's kind of like right there, together. Um, and I've had conversations with people, and I know there is a stigma around homelessness that, well, everyone became homeless because of drugs. Uh, More often than not, that's wrong. Um, very, very briefly, I just wanted to kind of put out there that stigma as well. And most of the time, from what I found out through conversations, is most of the time people succumb to addictions after becoming homeless. And a portion of that homelessness is attributed to domestic violence and unresolved, unattended, and unsupported domestic violence. Some people turn to addictive outlets to as coping mechanisms, and it can spiral into financial troubles and financial losses and things like that. But there's also a part of the homeless portion that also suffers from abuse, violence. I don't know if it would still be referred to as domestic violence, um, but still the same. Stemming from discrimination and just a lot of things. But I wanted to kind of throw that out there to kind of destigmatize that, as well as, just because you see someone who is homeless doesn't mean that they are an addict or they became an addict because they use drugs. Domestic violence is a large factor in that, as well as it leads to, unhealthy coping mechanisms or being kicked out of your residence because of either reporting or because of suffering from domestic violence when in the home and not having an outlet to get away from it. Um, do you have anything to add on that?
I mean, I think for me, whenever the topic of homelessness comes up and kind of the stigma and discrimination around that, I always turn to my personal experiences. Like, okay, I experienced homelessness when I was a child because my dad lost his job during the 2008 recession. Does that mean that he was a
Mhm.
drug addict or that I was a drug addict? I don't think
Right,
so. And would you treat
right.
a kid who's experienced homelessness the same way that you treat adults without knowing anything about their situation?
Absolutely. That's a really powerful. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. All right. Well, uh, I think that's about all the time we have for today. I really appreciate you being here again, and I look forward to having you back for even more amazing conversation. Let everybody know where they can find you.
Yeah, so the best place would be on my website, taylor-lock.com. It's got my contact information and all my socials on there. Um, Feel free to reach out.
Perfect. See you next time. Check us out on YouTube at Reah Higgs, ReahHagues. You can also keep up with us on Instagram at Just the Who Podcast.